Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Christina Lingell. Hey, Christina, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. So you spent a lot of time this week looking into the state's policies that are pending regarding transgender inclusion and exclusion, depending on where you fall in this debate. Tell us a little bit about what you encountered this week when you were addressing this issue.
Yeah, so I started the week going to Trans Day of Visibility, which was being held at the Capitol, and it's observed globally, but people put together a rally at the Capitol to highlight some of the bills that are intended to help trans people, but most importantly, to let representatives from the trans community speak. So there were several really good speakers who talked about their experiences and why these bills matter, and most importantly, why visibility matters, because one of the biggest things that you'll hear is just we exist. That doesn't seem like something that is factually up for debate. Of course, trans people exist, but there are a lot of people who kind of dismiss that. And so a big thing behind the day is just saying, hey, we see you and we're here.
Yes, and the same day, with curious timing, the Senate actually was promoting one of their bills that would ban transgender women in women's sports. And this is something that has been, it's been a discussion all over the country, but I think it's really, people think of Pennsylvania when they think of this because of the University of Pennsylvania and Leah Thomas, who was a swimmer there, who was competing on the men's team for 3 years before she transitioned. And so she is very much the face of this issue. What is at the heart of people who don't want trans inclusion in traditionally male and female spaces is that there is, scientifically recognized biological differences between the sexes. And as much as everyone deserves equal rights, there is a concern that the inclusion of particularly transgender women who were assigned male at birth, that including them in female spaces that were basically created for their protection, for their privacy, that is erasing the rights of them and erasing their personhood in that way. And you actually spoke with one of the former UPenn swimmers who really is a leading voice on this issue. And can you tell us more about what she had to say?
Yeah, I spoke with Paula Scanlon, who has become a media personality following her graduation from UPenn. She did swim alongside Leah Thomas, who was, as you said, a swimmer on the men's team for 3 years before transitioning and joining the women's team. So there's a really multi-layered discussion being had about trans women specifically in sports. And I asked Scanlon what she kind of thought was at the heart of the issue. And it very quickly got away from the idea that it was about the competitive advantage that men may physically have that would, kind of in a lot of people's minds, obliterate the ability for a woman to really compete in her sport. For example, Scanlon talked about how before joining the women's team, Leah Thomas had personal bests that no one on her team was ever going to be able to meet. And part of that has to do with things like muscle mass. Men have larger hearts and larger lung capacity, and on average, just have a physical strength that typically exceeds women. Having said that, that is really just the tip of the iceberg of this conversation. And I want to clarify, because I don't think it gets a lot of attention, but in the trans community, we have people saying, well, gender exists on a spectrum. I know personally, we all know, I'm sure, I know a woman who is a basketball player, and she is much larger than several men that I know. I mean, we all have friends who are falling on different places on the physical spectrum. So a lot of people have argued for doing more measurement-based analysis in terms of what gender you get to play for in a sport, in terms of measuring testosterone or estrogen. And that's especially relevant, when we talk about male hormones. Those similarly are hormones that people take when they want a competitive advantage. So that is a scientific element of the problem. But Scanlon doesn't leave it at that, and most people talking about trans people aren't leaving it at that. So that's the real issue. Scanlon talked a lot about specifically her experience as a sexual assault survivor, feeling uncomfortable sharing a bathroom with someone with male genitalia. And I think that's a valid concern, obviously, and that's part of the conversation. But when that turns into saying, well, he's a man, which she specifically misgenders Leah Thomas whenever she talks about him publicly. She has said publicly that trans people might believe that they are the gender that they are, but that doesn't make it true. And she's among a very large body of Americans who are not just saying, oh, well, we don't want them messing up the curve in women's sports, but saying we don't want them, period. And that's a really, it's really difficult to reconcile this idea that it has to do with protecting women in sports. And also, we're going to say all these really hateful things that negate somebody's existence. It's just a tough line to walk, because there is a very valid discussion to be had about how we operate sports and keep it fair.
And so, SB 9 isn't the only bill that's out there that deals with this issue. I know that there's bills that are pending, but are unlikely to go places because we have a divided legislature. So that's important to keep in mind with all of these bills. There is a bill out there that would redefine marriage between one man and one woman, which of course is very much in keeping with a more traditionalist viewpoint of marriage, one that has been overturned by the Supreme Court in the last 10 years. However, that is just one. There's also bills that target the inclusion of gender ideology curriculum, which isn't specifically about transgenderism, but does circle around that a lot. But then there's also other bills proposed by Democrats that want to address more basic issues that transgender people face in the daily life, right?
Yeah. The Democrats have a couple bills out there that are aimed at making the process of name changes an easier process for trans people. This would also benefit, frankly, a lot of women. You and I have both been married in the state of Pennsylvania. It's a very convoluted process to change your name here. So they're trying to change it to a more administrative and less judicial process, which would really help trans people who are changing their names as they transition. And it would also involve, I believe, making resources available to make it easier to understand the process and navigate the system.
We could go on and on about the complexity of this issue. In Pennsylvania, it's a very interesting discussion just because of how closely divided our state government is, and the national conversation around transgender issues, how University of Pennsylvania has played a role in all of this. And it seems to me, as someone who has been observing this past week as well, that there just is a fundamental breakdown between the ideological beliefs that are held on both sides of this issue. And I believe, from my observation, that there's a lot of questions that we haven't dealt with in good faith in order to find the right balance for how to deal with them. Because yes, transgender people are asking, I'm a person. I learned through research that the term trans rights is not even something that the LGBT community loves, because they were like, we want rights. We're people. We just want rights like everybody else. At the same time, women do have, every right to feel uncomfortable if they're changing next to somebody who is, whose physiology reads male rather than female. And those people may not be firebrand person, social media policy or, personalities, but are legitimately, good, kind people who just are concerned with that aspect of it. And so I think that, like I said, there's a lot that is lost in translation. And if any state has a chance to really find a way forward, it might as well be Pennsylvania. So
absolutely. And I think what you said is a really good point, because Thomas had a lot of teammates and not everyone was comfortable in the locker room, and not everyone was comfortable with the competitive advantage that they saw. But not everyone then turned around and had all of these really hostile things to say about trans people. In fact, a lot of them wrote a letter together saying, we support Leah, we love Leah, but when it comes to athletics, this is our thoughts. So there's definitely, and I think that probably represents a lot of Americans, right? Like a lot of us, I mean, I'm really not a sports person, so I don't know a lot about it, but a lot of us are like, okay, this is a conversation we can have about sports, but also we want to support and be kind to our neighbors, right?
Right. It's very America to say you are free to live in the way that makes you happy. And so I think that a lot of us, like you said, the trans issue is one that is like, if that's what makes you happy, go for it. I think where it's become hot water is now where you're going into the traditionally female spaces. And then when people feel like their children are being brought into it, that's when there is resistance. And that's a much more nuanced conversation as far as who should, how should we introduce kids to this? How should they be, normalized to understand that there's all different types of relationships, all different types of people, and parents aren't wrong for wanting to have more control over that situation, but it's definitely something that we need to work out, and that will hopefully be worked out soon. So to follow more of this story, please check us out at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania, or like and subscribe to this channel to check out more of our content. Thanks for joining us, Christina.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.